Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. A Duel for a Bride. Chapter 1. We really shouldn't do this, Tina said in a low voice, even though it had been her idea, and she seemed amused. When she looked up at her best friend Leah, there was excitement in her expression and a smile stretching her lips. They were both just 16 and bored, both the only daughters of doting fathers. Nothing would ever come of their pranks anyway. They were sitting on Tina's bed, a selection of photographs scattered around them. In her hands, Tina held a letter she had written for the Matrimonial Times, along with a photograph of herself. The idea of actually being a mail-order bride was laughable to her. Tina was a city girl through and through, and she would never marry some farmer instead of a polished city man. But the idea still held its sparkle. She had seen daughters of her father's friends as they had gone off to the West, and there was adventure in it, along with a sort of freedom Tina herself was unlikely to experience, freedom to choose a man, to go out in the world and lead another life entirely. It wasn't enough to convince her to do it, but it surely was enough to make this prank a little more exciting than it would have been otherwise. In the quieter moments, when she was bored or tired, Tina could sit and fantasize about the what-ifs. What if a man writes back, looking for you? Leah asked, a bit more apprehensive, but her hand was raised and hiding a smile to match her friend's. Of course, a man will write looking for me, Tina said, pushing her honey-brown hair behind a shoulder. You'll see. Lots of them will see my picture and fall madly in love with me. Leah laughed, snatching the letter and the photograph from Tina's hands. She shoved both inside the envelope they had procured for this prank and neatly sealed it up. Right, and then what? Leah asked. I'll be by your side trying to shove the men away from you. They'll write back, Tina said with a giggle, and then I will say no. As if I could be some farmer's wife. I know Cindy seems more than happy whenever she comes back to visit her family, but I don't belong in the West in the middle of the dust and the cows. I'm going to marry a good city man. A good businessman. I wouldn't mind a life in the West, Leah said, looking down at the letter in her hands. But you wouldn't have the courage to become a mail-order bride, Tina said, because she knew her friend. I suppose you'd marry a man out West if your father found a good one for you. Right? Right, Leah said. Well, it's not like it's my picture here. And if anyone goes wrong, Tina, remember this was your idea. Nothing is going to go wrong, Tina said with the certainty of someone who had never had anything go wrong in her life before. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Tina was partially right. Nothing came out of the prank, not for a very long time. So, where are all those men from out West that I have to fend off for you? Leah asked her on more than one occasion, laughing. In truth, not a single man had asked Tina to be his bride. Not one. Of course, Tina was completely unaware that the agency had misplaced her letter and her photograph for 2 entire years. She didn't know that her advert had never been posted. As it was, the fact that she'd remained unchosen was a private humiliation. Not a word about it, Tina would respond to Leah with clear impatience. I don't want to hear one word. And so, Leah would obediently close her mouth. As time went on, the prank was finally forgotten by the two girls, until 2 years later, when the agency found Tina's photograph again, and mistook it for something recent and posted it with haste. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. John Bernett sat at his kitchen table with the newspaper in his hands, quiet and alone. He was a farmer through and through, the kind of man who was born for the West, steady and kind and true. With his 30 years and his dark hair, he was considered handsome and a good catch. Anyone who had been actually looking for a husband would have been more than joyous to be found by this man. He looked around him with his light brown eyes. His kitchen had felt sad and empty ever since his mother had passed a few months before, and the whole house had lost its spark when his father had followed mere weeks after. Despite the heartache from his losses, John's life was still good. The farm was doing well, and he enjoyed his work, though he would need help before long. He looked back down at the newspaper, his thumb stroking the paper as he thought. There were many men around him who had found brides through the adverts he was looking at right now, and he always envied their contentment when he saw the couples together around town. His life was more than tolerable, and he was a decent man, but there weren't many women out here in the West. John smiled thinking about his mother. Before she had gotten ill, she had often nagged at him about finding a good wife to help him and take care of him. She hadn't lived long enough to see him finally go after it, but he was finally ready to make her wish come true. John smiled at his decision. He'd send the agency a letter and ask them about finding someone who seemed compatible to him. Some weeks later, he was sent Tina Bosworth's picture. John felt an instant connection with the woman through her photograph. She appeared to be a small woman with a sharp smile and bright eyes. John read the letter she had sent to the agency looking for a husband, hardly able to tear his eyes away from her photograph for long. Her letter felt like it had been written for him. She sounded smart and bright, and seemed to be looking for everything he was. John grinned, clutching the photograph in one hand, knowing in his heart that he wouldn't be alone for much longer. He wrote back, his hopes soaring high, but weeks and then months went by, and he was never received a reply. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Tina could hardly believe she was now 18 years old. Leah had married off, leaving her feeling lonely. Her pranks and jokes didn't have much feeling behind them anymore. They weren't nearly as entertaining without her friend around. She had hardly been without Leah before since they'd been best friends since childhood. It almost made Tina wish she could marry someone who lived close to where Leah lived these days, whether she liked the man or not. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Tina was lying in bed, wishing that her father would take her out to dinner. That way she could at least leave the house for a bit. The front doorbell sounded, and she sat upright, intrigued. Her father hadn't warned her of any visitors, so perhaps it was a surprise for her? Even if it weren't, it was sure to be something more interesting than the nothing she was occupied with right now. She gathered her skirts and dashed out of her room and down the stairs. Her mother, who had been walking up the stairs, complained as she went by, but Tina barely heard her. It wasn't the most seemly thing for a young woman to run and appear flushed at the door, but Tina wasn't often to be stopped by convention when she wanted something. She arrived at the foyer just in time to see her father confusedly welcoming in a handsome man. Tina stilled beside the door, hiding as much as possible while still being able to see what was happening. The man was tall and tanned in a way she didn't usually see. His hair was brown, but kissed blonde in places, like he had been out in the sun his whole life. His clothes were simple. His eyes were light brown, and when he caught sight of Tina standing half-hidden behind the door frame, she watched them go wide and sparkle. "Tina Bosworth?" he asked, taking a step toward her as if unaware of her father standing right in front of him. "Are you here for my daughter?" Tina's father asked, a foreboding frown on his face. I'm John Bernett. I'm here for," the man fumbled, shoving his hands inside his pockets looking for something. He finally found it and pulled it out, triumphant. It was the photograph of Tina from 2 years ago, one she instantly recognized. Her stomach fell to her feet. "I'm here regarding your advert," John Bernett said. "I'm a farmer in the West. I was sent your advert and wrote to you, but you never answered, so I thought. Well, I decided to come and check things out for myself. I had to travel this way anyway, for business purposes. The letter you wrote, it was like you had been a skin for me, and I found you, and I want to propose." "Are you talking about a mail-order bride advert?" Tina's father asked, shocked and confused, turning to his daughter for an explanation. Tina squared her shoulders and worked to gather her wits. She walked out into the foyer proper, usually not in the business of hiding from any man. She didn't look at the farmer who had come to propose to her. Her eyes were on her father. "It was a joke, Daddy," she said with a shake of her head. "Leah and I sent that 2 years ago and nothing came of it. I don't know what this man is doing with my photograph right now. I'm sorry, Mr. John Bernett, but I have no intention of marrying right now, much less a simple farmer from the West, instead of a good businessman from the city. This is not the kind of thing you make jokes with, her father admonished her, disappointment falling heavily on his expression. Tina would have winced if she were any other woman, but while she didn't, she still felt her heart constrict at her father's censure. It wasn't the sort of joke she would make right now, but this was something from 2 years ago. It was all fake? John Bernett asked, his expression stunned. Tina had made the mistake of looking at him. The man looked distraught, and her photograph had crumpled when he closed his hand into a fist around it. Well, it wasn't all fake, she said. But I still don't wish to marry you or anyone else right now. It was simply a joke. In truth, I'm stunned that you came all the way here to propose to me after not getting an answer. I can scarcely believe it, Mr. Bernett. I am sorry, but there's nothing more to be done. Uncomfortable now, although a bit satisfied with the fact that she would be able to write Leah saying a man had come for her after all, Tina swiveled around and made her way back up to her room. As she left, she heard her father's voice rise up in an apology for her irresponsible behavior. She was filled with shame, but she shoved it aside. She hadn't asked the man to come, had she? Chapter 2. John slowly glanced around before he left. He couldn't help himself. He loved his farm and the decision to leave it hadn't been an easy one. He hoisted his bag over his shoulder, walked out the door, and locked it. The house was big, and it had been his home for so long, yet John felt confident in his decision to move to San Diego. A change of pace was just what he needed after everything that had happened. He had gone to meet Tina with such high expectations, and having them all crushed in such a harsh manner had broken something in him. Maybe it had been silly to fall so deeply in love with a letter and a photograph. It had been a simple prank, but it had affected him to his core. She had called him a simple farmer. Even though John had made the lightning decision to move to a city and find a job right then and there, he staunchly told himself her words hadn't influenced him at all. Tina Bosworth rejected you, he told himself quietly while he made his way to his horse. You're puttin' all that behind you and making a new beginning. Some city bustle will be good for you, and you'll be able to have some luxuries once you get there. He sighed heavily. Or at least I hope so. He patted his horse's side. Though he would love having those city luxuries, he thought of the sweets he hadn't had since his mother had died. Maybe some finer clothing would be nice, too, some that wouldn't survive farm life. But would miss a lot from home, too. The horses were favorites of his, and it just wouldn't be the same. He decided he would ride his horse to the station, and then the cowhand he had hired would ride it back to the farm. The man would take care of the farm until John returned. He'd decided not to sell it, just in case he had a change of heart. The farm was his and paid for, and he didn't want to abandon it completely. He likely wouldn't return anytime soon, but he just might come back one day. He swung a leg over his horse and started to ride out. He closed his eyes against the wind in his face just for a moment, savoring the feeling. The thought of becoming a city man felt foreign right then, and he experienced a flash of doubt. John loved this life. The image of Tina's expression and the timbre of her voice as she had said those cutting words entered his mind, and John opened his eyes. Why he let this virtual stranger influence him so strongly, he couldn't rightly say. He just knew that she had, no matter how much he tried to deny it. He had gotten a recommendation from a friend who had moved to San Diego a few months back. He was to look for a man named Raymond Cabanne. Apparently, Mr. Cabanne was a rich businessman who worked with metal reserves around the whole of the country, and he was looking for someone new to work in his company. That someone could very well be John. John planned to speak to him as soon as he arrived in the city. He'd get himself that job. And he would prove something, either to himself, or to someone else, he couldn't say, nor did he want to. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Raymond Cabanne looked as rich as a man could look, and he hired John almost instantly. He clapped John on his shoulder, gave him a smile, and said he could use an honest farmer as a worker for once, instead of arrogant city boys. John's honest and hardworking nature put him in Mr. Cabanne's good graces almost immediately, and only a week after being hired, John was promoted as the man's personal assistant. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Another 2 years passed, and Tina was now 20 years old. She was no longer a young girl who sat on her bed waiting for excitement to arrive only to rebuff it when it came, if it wasn't exactly to her tastes. She was now old enough to know that wasn't how the world worked. She still didn't want to marry, though. She sat at the desk in the room she rented from an older couple whose daughter had recently moved away from San Diego, where Tina now lived. She tapped her finger against her lips, thinking about what she would write to Leah. San Diego has been good to me, she started. There are good restaurants and better theaters, although it's a bit crude compared to the East. Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, who rent me their daughter's room, are kind people. I'm glad Mrs. Fletcher often cooks for me too, or else I would likely starve. Or at least, I'd go to the bakery and eat nothing but bread all day long. My job as a teacher has been going well. The children are charming, and I like them much more than I thought I would. You know me, I never really was a fan of children. But they are curious and excited about everything, and it brightens my day. I'm glad I decided to leave home to come here, after all. I don't miss Victor at all. Tina paused a second and sighed, wondering if she should cross that out and not mention Victor at all. He was a suitor she had encouraged at first, because he was tall and charming and as gentlemanly as the best the city could give, but he had gotten tiresome very quickly. If asked, Tina would fervently deny it, but the truth was that part of the reason she'd moved away had been to escape marriage to him. She wasn't one to run from a man, but any good woman knew when it was time to swallow her pride and be sensible. Not that Victor would be a terrible man to marry, he seemed decent and would certainly give her a fairly comfortable life, but she had made her decision not to be with him and that was that. She decided to leave him in her letter to Leah after all. What did it matter at this point? Hopefully, Tina would never see the boring, tiresome man again. How are you doing, Leah? How's your Mr. Hemsworth and your house? You're too close-lipped about your man. He is treating you well, isn't he? Let me know, or else I'll have to visit you as soon as possible and make an investigation myself. I jest. Tell James the first miss him as well, and I'll be visiting you too as soon as I'm more settled here, or perhaps you could come see me? With hope. Tina. Tina smiled at her words, already anticipating the answer her best friend would give her. She stood up from her desk. She had to leave for work soon, and after school, she would pass by the local church to say a quick prayer. She was looking forward to the next Sunday when people would bring food for a community meal, and she would be able to meet her new neighbors properly. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The last place Tina would ever have expected to meet John Bernett again, and never in her wildest fantasies had she ever thought they would cross paths again, was at the local church in San Diego. But as she took the first step into the building, she caught sight of a man standing and chatting quietly in the corner with a woman and another older man. Though 2 years had gone by after a meeting that barely lasted 10 minutes, she recognized him instantly. His hair was still that light brown, but his posture was straighter, and he definitely wasn't wearing farmer's clothes. Tina barely managed to take stock of him, how handsome his closely shaved face seemed, how easy his smile, how sure his hands, before it was time for her to rush to a seat because Mass started. Tina sat far away from him and tried not to stare. It was unbecoming and disrespectful, but her eyes veered back to him as soon as she dropped her guard. He seemed different. That was all, she reasoned with herself. She was simply noting the changes in him. When Mass ended and people started to get up, Tina quickly stood without talking to anyone and made her way out. The courtyard where food was already being served was wide with lush grass and a few benches, and she sat down and tried to think of what she would do. What is John Bernett doing in San Diego? She asked herself. What is he doing in San Diego dressed smartly like that, talking to people as if he frequents this church every Sunday? Not for the first time, Tina wished Leah was there so she could talk things over with her. As it was, she was already composing a letter in her mind. Dear Leah, she would write, it happens that the farmer who asked for my hand 2 years ago and which I roundly rejected is actually quite polished and handsome wearing a suit. Tina Bosworth, came a shocked voice. Tina looked up, not having realized she had been staring morosely at the ground. She stared into the deep brown eyes of the very man she had been thinking about. An embarrassed flush rose to her face. She thought suddenly of the stupid prank her 16-year-old self had played on this man, and she cringed internally. Mr. John Bernett, she stood and greeted him back, looking around for the two people who had been chatting with him before, but found neither of them close. "Ah," John said, his voice soft in his surprise. "You remembered." "I didn't imagine." "Well, it's only polite," Tina said somewhat awkwardly. She thought about apologizing to him again, but she was too discombobulated to do it, too busy noting the difference in the way he spoke. Although farming country still lingered on him, his words were firmer, more polished, like he had spent a good while in the city. Tina realized suddenly that this man must have lived here in San Diego since they'd seen each other before. "You live here, then?" she blurted. "Yes, I moved here," he said, looking at his hands for a moment before lifting his eyes back to hers, like a man who didn't want to look like he was avoiding anything. "And you, Miss Bosworth?" "Assumin' you're still Miss Bosworth and not." "No, I'm not married," Tina said a tad too quickly. "And you?" John Bernett blinked at her for a moment, then opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, he was interrupted by the arrival of the woman who had been hanging onto his arm before. The woman promptly hung onto him again, winding her hand around his elbow. Tina took note of her pale complexion, her golden hair and her wide blue eyes, and resisted the urge to cross her arms. "This is Rachel Cabanne," John said after a prompting look from the woman herself, his voice low and pensive. Cabanne, Tina thought. She recognized that name from somewhere. She was probably a wealthy person's daughter, for she certainly looked rich in that dress and those earrings. "Tina Bosworth," Tina introduced herself in turn. She put on her best smile and nodded at the woman. "Well, it was certainly nice to see you today, but I must be off." She quickly left them and felt sure they were gaping at her speedy exit. Goodness, but she really was a fool to find herself smitten by the very man who had proposed to her 2 years ago and now had found another woman to call his own. Chapter 3. Tina woke up feeling bored and craving some kind of an adventure. It was a day off for her, and thus she had nothing more than a few chores to do. She quickly got dressed, accepted the breakfast that Mrs. Fletcher had made for her, and set out for the nearby hills. A walk would do her well, she thought. She lived here now, and she wanted to get to know her new home as well as she could. Besides, it was a safe area, she was in no danger walking around alone, or so Mrs. Fletcher had advised her. She put on her best shoes and set off, intent on letting the scenery occupy her time. As she walked, she worked hard to not think about John Bernett. Or Rachel Cabanne. She wouldn't think about that woman at all either, even though the sight of her holding onto John's elbow brought up something envious inside of her. It's a sin, she told herself, envy is a sin. But she still envied the woman for the ease with which she had leaned against John. "You've only seen him once," Tina admonished herself as she walked toward the hills. "There's no need for you to get like this. He's just a man, and you don't even know him." But as she looked up at the blue sky, she remembered that day 2 years ago, how he had traveled to her door to propose to her with her photograph clutched in his hand like he wouldn't ever let it go. Such a memory stayed with a woman. Tina had received more than one declaration of love during the ensuing 2 years, and many gifts had been handed to her by those who sought to marry her. But nothing had been as simple and as truthful as that one sincere farmer who showed up on her doorstep with a smile. And now he was close enough to show up at her church, where she would probably have to see him every week. Only now, he wore a suit and spoke like a city man. Tina was smitten, she really was. If he had looked and sounded like this when he had shown up at her door 2 years ago, Tina thought, she would have at least hesitated before rejecting him as soundly as she had. She would have spoken to him, and maybe even allowed him a dance somewhere, and nothing. He has Miss Rachel Cabanne now, she told herself harshly. She put her hands on her hips as if admonishing a child, except there was no one there but herself. She lifted her head, gazed around, and blinked. There really wasn't anyone near but her, and she didn't recognize where she was. She turned and looked back, but she also didn't recognize the path she had just walked. Had she been so deep in thought, she'd gotten lost? She felt dread pool in her stomach. She deserved this, she scolded herself. She was shallow and had been thoughtless and even cruel those 2 years earlier. And now, here she was thinking that if John had been different, had accommodated her more, then she would have been kinder. Shame surged through her. But feeling ashamed wasn't going to help her be any less lost. What was she going to do now? Asterisk asterisk asterisk. And I don't know where she's gone off to. Usually, the words wouldn't be enough to catch John's attention. He was walking leisurely around a market, looking for something to buy for Rachel, who had been the one to ask him to come here for that purpose. He wasn't in the business of listening to people's conversations as he walked. He was a straightforward man, and he had business to attend to, and even if any other man would have found it silly, he thought it was important. But the voice sounded distressed, and it was one he recognized. Mrs. Fletcher was a sweet woman and a good neighbor, and John wasn't the kind of man to listen to a woman in trouble and not do his best to help. Plus he knew, after a bout of casual conversation with people at church last Sunday, that Tina was staying with Mrs. Fletcher and her husband. Did that mean the woman was talking about Tina, and she didn't know where Tina was? He made his way to her side, put a hand on her shoulder, and smiled disarmingly when she startled and turned to him. "John. Don't scare me like that," she admonished, though a bit of playfulness had entered her voice. Though, she turned serious again. "I could use some help from a man like you, if you're not too busy right now." John traded a look with the woman's husband, who was standing by her side with his arms crossed and a pensive expression on his face. "What is it?" "Tina's gone off to explore the hills and hasn't come back yet," Mrs. Fletcher said anxiously. "The girl is new in town, and I just worry. She barely had anything for breakfast, and what if she has fallen or is in trouble?" Alarm coursed through John, but he kept his expression pleasant. "Don't worry," he said with a smile. "I'll look for her, and everything will be all right." The look of relief on Mrs. Fletcher's face was reward for his offer. Even her husband looked relieved. He nodded at them, tipped his hat, and left without buying anything for Rachel. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. John found Tina standing alone with her arms crossed and a blank, patient expression on her face, giving him the strange impression that all along she had been waiting for him to turn up. But he was wrong, for her expression changed when she caught sight of him appearing from among the hills. At that moment, she looked distinctly worried. He couldn't begrudge her that. What happened 2 years ago had stayed with them both, it seemed, and it satisfied him to think that she regretted what she had done to him, if only a little bit. What luck, he'd thought when he saw her at church the Sunday before Rachel had caught his arm, and he'd thought what rotten luck indeed. "I heard you might be lost," he said when he got closer. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she told him with a shake of her head, letting her arms fall to her sides. "I prayed someone would turn up eventually, and here you are. Though I didn't really expect you to come." John shrugged. "I would never ignore helping someone who needed it. I find it kind of strange, though, how you were just standing there, staring at nothing. Usually a lost woman would be wandering around, trying to find her way back and shouting for help." As he finished speaking, he tried not to grimace, suddenly realizing how much like a farmer he still sounded, even to his own ears. "It wouldn't make sense to do that," Tina said, apparently not taking note of his way of speaking at all. "If I hope help is coming, it's best to stay still and wait, and that's just what I did. But, thank you, John. I still don't know my way around." "It's all right," he said quietly. "I'll help you make your way back." He turned and gestured with his head for her to follow him, and after a moment of hesitation, she set a hand on the crook of his elbow. Her touch was light, as if she was afraid this wasn't allowed. John swallowed and resisted the urge to set his hand on top of hers. Once upon a time, he had thought she would be by his side always, and here she was, but only temporarily. How life played tricks on a fellow. Have you lived here long? Tina asked after a moment of silence, turning slightly to look at him from beneath her long eyelashes. About 2 years, he told her, his mouth going dry. Oh, no, he thought to himself, not hearing her response. It was obvious now how he still wasn't over her, and she was just so beautiful still, so much a woman now instead of the 16-year-old girl she had been in the picture he threw away. He could feel her strength, and he was painfully aware of how close she was to him. He could practically breathe her in. An image of Rachel rose to his mind. You can't, he thought, dismayed. You can't still be drawn to Tina. What could he do? His engagement to Rachel was basically settled already, and he was indebted to her father. He couldn't do anything to break that bond, or to destroy his commitment. His thoughts flew in circles the whole way back to town. Tina's hand stayed in his arm, and her eyes bore straight ahead. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Rachel had been sitting by the unlit fireplace and looking out the window when John arrived, and her view through the glass gave her the opportunity to know he was coming before he rang the bell. This meant she could dash to the door and be the one to open it for him. It was a game of sorts between them, and it always brought a smile to their faces. But Rachel noted today that John's smile was absent, as if his mind were occupied with something else, and his hands were empty, which was just as odd. She had sent him out precisely to buy her a hat pin or a new bracelet from the market 2 blocks away, and he had never neglected to bring something back to her once she had requested it of him, even when any other man would have grown annoyed with her. John? She asked, her eyes narrowing as he stepped forward and entered the house proper. Didn't you go to the market? Didn't you bring me anything? Oh, are you hiding it, John? Is it a surprise? He blinked down at her as if confused. No, he said, and then his tone of voice grew apologetic. I'm so sorry, Rachel, I was browsing the stalls when I heard Mrs. Fletcher in. You really didn't get me anything? She asked, wounded. I'll go out there and get something right now, he promised her. It's just I was browsing when Mrs. Fletcher said Tina hadn't come back yet, so I went off to find her. Rachel felt herself still. Tina? She finally asked, her eyes narrowing further. Who was this woman that her John was speaking about so casually? The woman he'd gone to find after abandoning his task of finding a gift for her? Tina Bosworth, John clarified as if Rachel had been asking for her last name. We met her at church a few days ago. Short, with brown hair. I remember her, Rachel said, her suspicion hardening in her heart like a rock. She remembered the woman all right. She had stood too close to John, and after she had left, John had looked around as if trying to locate her the rest of the day, until they had come back home. She got lost, John repeated. So I went to find her. The smile he had on his face was for her, Rachel realized, not for their game, but for this woman. Whatever it was that had happened with them when John had abandoned Rachel's gift to run after her, it had left him with this stupid smile on his face. Besotted, Rachel thought with horror, jealously roaring through her mind. Smitten. That's what he is. He has never looked at me like that. Rachel was not a stupid woman. She knew their engagement had started as something between the men, between John and her father, and she hadn't had a problem with it. It wasn't like John had eyes for other women, and he was sweet to her. But his eyes had found someone, after all. Rachel closed her hands into fists. I see, she said. Well, next time she gets lost, she can find her way back alone. How rude of her to make other people interrupt their morning to go after her. If you see her again, John, you shouldn't speak to her. John gave her a puzzled look. It's not her fault she got lost. Don't defend her, Rachel said, resisting the urge to cross her arms. I'm going out to buy you something now, John said. All right? Rachel watched him go, fire in her eyes. Chapter 4. Tina almost laughed when she caught sight of John rushing back not 20 minutes after he had dropped her off into the waiting, anxious arms of Mrs. Fletcher. She and the Fletchers were still wandering around the market, and Tina had been admiring a particularly fancy hat when John appeared, looking around with a somewhat frazzled look on his face. Tina thought about calling out to him. She could ask him what he was doing here again, if he had forgotten something, or if he needed help. But she remembered Raymond Cabanne and stayed quiet instead, thinking to herself that his saving her earlier this morning was more than enough interaction for the day. Thankfully or not, Mrs. Fletcher had none of her misgivings. "John," she exclaimed, waving at the man until she had his attention. "What are you doing back here? You look like you need some help." "Hello again," he said, looking from Mrs. Fletcher to Tina with a somewhat embarrassed look on his face. "I had come here to buy something, but I forgot to get it when I went off to find Tina." Tina smiled. "I feel somewhat responsible for that. And I'm sorry that everyone was so worried. I'd heard there was no danger out in the hills." "I wasn't worried, I was just," he didn't complete the thought, ending it with a shrug. "But I would accept some help," he admitted, keeping his eyes on Tina. "I need to buy a gift, but I'm not sure what to get." "Well," Tina said, her smile dimming at the thought of obvious recipient of this gift. "I can point you toward what I would like to receive from a man, but I don't know how much help that would be. Your woman doesn't seem much like me, after all." "She isn't like you." His stark comment took her back, and she tried not to publicly wince. She deserved that, she supposed. "Buy her a hat," Mrs. Fletcher said decisively, grabbing John's wrist to tow him away. "There was a stall a bit on the side that had the prettiest things I've ever seen, and I just know which one you should get." John glanced back at Tina, who had stayed instead of following, and something passed between the two of them that she couldn't begin to define. ******. Tina and John saw each other again in church the following Sunday, again while out doing shopping, and another time while dining in a cafe. As each of them settled into the knowledge that they would continue meeting each other regularly because they were neighbors, and as the wounds and the shame of what happened 2 years before slowly disappeared, their smiles grew wider and their conversations longer. Rachel was often holding on to John's arm, and therefore, she witnessed each brief but lingering meeting. Her grip on him appeared tighter and tighter each time, but John didn't seem to notice. Rachel stopped staying at home when he was out and started to accompany him everywhere, but whatever guilt he felt at having the two women present at the same time wasn't enough to stop him from seeking Tina anyway. It made Rachel's blood boil, and the only reason she hadn't started warning the other woman to stay away from her man was she knew John would probably hate her for it. She needed to play smarter. "John," she murmured one day while they were out. They were on a walk, but of course, Tina and the Fletchers had also decided to take a walk at the same time. John started to walk in their direction, but Rachel planted her feet and held him back. "Yes?" he asked, glancing down at her. "You know," she said lightly, her eyes wide and innocent, "I was talking to our neighbors, the Morrisons, the other day, and they were telling me some things about this Tina who we've been meeting so much these days." "Oh?" John said, looking at her with more attention. "Of course, he pays attention when I start to talk about her," Rachel thought disdainfully. "I heard she moved out here to San Diego to escape some embarrassment," Rachel continued. "It was all a lie, of course. She never spoke to the neighbors, much less about Tina. It is said that she's left a man and even children behind to come here, and now she's lying to everyone." John's eyebrows furrowed. "What? I haven't heard anything like that." "Yes," Rachel said, nodding vigorously. "They said she's had 2 husbands already and children, and she's out here hiding because she's such an embarrassment." Her words, which were spoken with the intention of horrifying him, had the opposite effect. John's expression smoothed out and he smiled. "Oh, well, I know that's a lie," he said, satisfied. "There's no way she has children. I know she was still living with her parents until right before she came out here." Rachel stilled. "But how would you know that?" she asked as lightly as she could. John paused, then looked away. She mentioned it once." Rachel's hands closed into fists. She didn't believe him. John didn't know what to do. He felt both confused and desperate. He sat on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands and tried to think of a way out of this situation. He couldn't keep seeking out Tina like this. Granted, when he did see her, it was always by coincidence. But he looked for her wherever he went. It was tearing him apart. Every time Tina smiled, every time he saw the crinkles around her eyes, every time she waved a hand or touched him casually or tucked her hair behind her ear or even squinted against the sun, his heart skipped a beat. She was so lovely. If only she had accepted him back when he believed her mail-order bride advert had been real. If only it had been real. He would be on his farm now, back with his horses and working the land, and she would be by his side. But he had Rachel by his side now, and he couldn't break things off with her. He couldn't, he owed too much to her father. Mr. Cabanne had taken him under his wing and helped him rebuild his life after Tina's rejection had broken him. But how could he keep stringing Rachel along? It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair. And he did like her. She didn't deserve this. He kept thinking his feelings for Tina were just left over from before. That he didn't really care for her, how could he, after the way she'd treated him? He was certain his feelings for her would fade into nothing. It was just a matter of time. But time had been passing with each day that dawned, and his feelings did not diminish. If anything, they grew stronger. What rotten luck that Tina had to cross the entire country and end up right where he lived. He had no idea what to do. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Rachel had no idea what to do. Well, she had ideas. She had many ideas. She sat in her room and combed her wet hair after bathing and thought a lot about those ideas, and about how bad they all were. They weren't bad by nature, no, but Rachel wasn't stupid, and though she wanted that other woman away from John, she didn't want to do anything that would make John hate her. She didn't know what to do that wouldn't leave him disliking her. Any sort of confrontation she could try to have with Tina would eventually reach his ears. Any further elaborate lies wouldn't last long. Any scandal she could create or any statement forbidding him from talking to Tina would leave him with a distaste for her. Men didn't like jealous women, no matter how justified. But John was hers. Rachel was young and rich and an only child, and she wasn't used to not getting what she wanted. John was one of the many things her father had brought home for her, and she loved him, and she would have him. She stood and left her room. She let her hair comb fall from her fingers to the floor and marched to her father's office, where she knew he would be poring over documents and savoring some drink. She entered without knocking and walked up to his desk. She crossed her arms. He slowly looked up at her with the same blue eyes she'd inherited from him. "Now," he said, "what's going on that's causing you make that face at me?" "John's smitten with that Tina woman," Rachel said, then crumbled. She sank into one of the chairs in front of her father's desk. "Daddy, I don't know what to do. Ever since she's arrived, John has not taken his eyes off of her. He hasn't been looking at me." Her father frowned and steepled his fingers. "I've heard of her," he said. "He's mentioned her once or twice. My girl, I noticed he's been different, too. He's been acting strange. He has not been concentrating at work as he had been before. He's been distracted." "That's because he's in love," she said and started to weep. "Oh, no," her father exclaimed, standing up at once. He walked around the desk and knelt by her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Rachel, don't cry, my girl. You know, look here, I'll fix this, don't worry. I have some plans for this man, and I don't want him leaving you to go after some other woman either. You'll see, I'll straighten things up with him as soon as possible." "He's never looked at me like he looks at her," Rachel whispered. "That's because he's a fool," her father said, then smiled shrewdly. "Which is why I'm going to get so much money out of him and that farm of his. Just you wait. I am no fool and neither are you." Chapter 5. Of course, Rachel had been lying when she told John that Tina had come to San Diego running from a husband and children. Tina had never been married and wasn't in any big rush to do so. Being honest, she liked the life she had now, living with a kind couple and paying her own bills, even if her father helped her with some things. She would marry sometime in the future. None of this meant she hadn't come to San Diego to escape a man, though. Victor Ackerman was someone she had indulged at first, but she soon realized her mistake, for she didn't love him. His absence was one of the many reasons she was free to enjoy San Diego. One Sunday, Tina was chatting quietly with Mr. Fletcher after Mrs. Fletcher had gone off to help with some tasks. People were mingling in the courtyard after Mass, and Tina was stunned to catch sight of Victor among the crowd. She gasped and turned her head to the side, hoping that he hadn't seen her as well. She didn't want to meet his gaze. What in the world was he doing there? Had he followed her across the country? "Tina, is everything all right?" Mr. Fletcher asked, putting a hand on her shoulder. It's fine, everything's fine," she assured him, not ready to reveal her shock. She looked around, trying to spot an exit she could take without being seen, but she was too late. Now John, with Rachel on his arm, was making his way over to her. Tina almost groaned. Curse this man for popping up everywhere she went. And curse Rachel for always being with him. "Hello, Mr. Fletcher and Tina," John greeted them as he came closer. "How is everything?" Tina couldn't stay there and make pleasant conversation where Victor could spot her. No matter how much she liked John, she barely heard what he was saying. She was much more focused on Victor and the way his head had swiveled around in her direction when she heard Victor say her name. Tina felt faint, but she managed to turn it into a smile. There was no way to avoid it now, she was trapped. Victor stepped up to them and joined the circle of conversation. "Why, Tina," Victor said, "there you are. I've been looking for you for ages now. Why didn't you tell me you were leaving for San Diego? I had to almost pry the information from your father." John and Rachel stilled. Tina kept the smile fixed on her face through sheer force of will, taking a step back when Victor stepped toward her. "Victor, hello," she managed. "What a surprise seeing you here. I did wish you had sent me a letter warning me you were coming. I'm surprised my father told you where I was." "Well, he didn't really want to," Victor said with a shrug. "But he could only deny me for so long." "And who is this?" came John's chilly voice. Tina sucked in her breath. John was looking at Victor with the beginnings of a frown and a line between his brows. Rachel looked from Victor to Tina and back at Victor with wide eyes. "Victor Ackerman," Victor said with a smile, reaching out to shake John's hand. His hand looked small in John's. He was altogether a man born and bred in the city, with his hair very dark and slicked back, and the look on his face somewhat smug. He looked John up and down and then turned to Tina with a cocked brow, as if to share a joke. Tina wasn't amused. In his perfect suit and his sun-kissed hair, John looked much better in her eyes than Victor. She gave Victor a chilly smile. "Tina, is this your beau from back east?" Rachel asked quite loudly. Tina cringed. John looked at Tina with disappointment, and there was something else in his gaze. Tina glanced at Rachel and cringed. John had no right to say anything to her about having another man or not. Didn't he always meet her with another woman on his arm? "I live in San Diego now," Tina said before Victor could open his mouth and make a mess of things. "And I'm here now," Victor reassured her with a smile, winding an arm around her waist. "And I'm here to stay. I didn't like so much distance between us." Tina glared at him, and missed the dismay in John's eyes and the triumph in Rachel's. "What?" Mr. Fletcher asked, confused. *****. John sat at the dinner table and stared at his food instead of eating it. Rachel sat by his side while her parents sat opposite them, as usual. The routine of it allowed John's mind to wander without too many worries. He wasn't even sure what it was he was eating. He lifted the fork to his mouth and chewed mechanically, his thoughts miles away. Had Rachel been right? He had dismissed the rumors Rachel had told him about Tina because they had seemed too outlandish. After all, when he had gone to see Tina 2 years before on that fateful day, there had been no ring on her finger, no mention of another beau, no indication that the young woman was anything but what she looked, a single young lady who lived with her parents. But it seemed as if Rachel had been right. Tina had come to San Diego to escape from a man, although not a husband. Though maybe not for long, John thought to himself. The words came to him unbidden and set his blood boiling. That lout will want to make her Tina Ackerman. John? Rachel asked, setting a hand on his arm, and snapping him out of his thoughts. He blinked at her, and his fork slipped from his fingers to clatter to the table. He winced, quickly picking it up again. He couldn't help but notice the scrutiny of her parents, who were studying him closely. He had seen them stare at him like this before. They thought he was acting odd. But he couldn't help it. He couldn't stop thinking about Tina. Sorry, John said, giving Rachel a strained smile. I was just thinking about things. My mind was wandering. What was it you were saying? Rachel looked at him with searching eyes, as if she could discern his thoughts by the lines on his face. Never mind, she said lightly, looking away and focusing back on her food. I just commented that it's a nice day out and maybe we could go out for a walk. Maybe, yes. They lapsed into silence again. John looked down at his nearly full plate and didn't feel hungry at all. The thought wouldn't stop nagging at him. Did Tina want to be Tina Ackerman? The answer should be a resounding no if it were true that she'd moved here to escape him. But what if she hadn't? What if she loved him? You'll see her tomorrow at the dance, John thought to himself. And then, you'll know. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Tina didn't want to attend this dance, but she'd had no way to duck out of it. It simply wouldn't do. The entire town was there enjoying the warm evening, and everyone would notice and wonder if she didn't come. Mrs. Fletcher had been so excited to help her prepare, handing her jewelry to bring out her eyes, and dresses for her to try on that she herself had worn as a younger woman. Tina hadn't had the heart to tell the sweet woman she wasn't going. She tried to stay close to the Fletchers that evening, but she didn't manage to evade Victor for long. He appeared at the dance looking like the most polished gentleman present, but it just didn't have the same appeal to her as usual. Her eyes were much more interested in John, who had shown up with an easy smile and windswept hair, who every few seconds would turn around and look at her as if wanting to make sure she was still there. It was charming, the sort of thing a young man in love would do, and it warmed her heart. But there Victor was, and he put himself directly in front of her line of sight, blocking her view of John. Hello, Victor, Tina said, her voice strained. Hello, darling, Victor said smoothly, giving her his best smile. In the beginning, such a smile would have made her smile smartly back, but tonight she just looked away. He didn't catch the hint and wound an arm around her waist. You're looking beautiful, Tina. Is all this jewelry yours? Did I give it to you? It looks like the sort of thing I gave you, back before you moved. The pieces are mine, actually, Mrs. Fletcher said with a flush on her cheeks, as if the compliment had been for her. Son, I don't want to intrude in what's not my business, Mr. Fletcher said with his arms crossed, his reproving gaze going from Tina, who was obviously uncomfortable, to Victor, who was obviously too comfortable. But you are being very liberal with a woman who's nothing to you. Nothing? Victor asked, his brow shooting up. Tina looked anxiously at him, and cringed when he started to laugh. Oh, Tina. What amusing friends you've made here in this backward town, he said, shaking his head in mirth. Mr. Fletcher, thank you for taking care of Tina while she's been away from home. I know she has not said much, but we're engaged, sir, and I plan to marry her very soon. Tina gaped at him. Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher turned to her with wide, confused eyes. Surely if that were true, she would have said something to them. They had grown quite close, after all, in the months she had been here, and they had been under the impression that she planned on staying in San Diego for much, much longer, not go back home after a few months to marry some man. No, Tina said awkwardly, desperately trying to get her thoughts straight. It was the truth, after all, they had been engaged. She had assumed that things were over once she had crossed the country to make a new life here in San Diego. She hadn't thought Victor would be crazy enough to come running after her. We were engaged before I moved, Tina ended up saying, only then noticing that John had stepped close to them. Had he heard? She didn't want him to misunderstand, but she could see that he did. But why should it matter anyway? There was nothing official between John and her, there were only her fantasies tying her to him. And John was clearly dating Rachel, and by the look on Rachel's face as she rapidly joined them, that wasn't going to change anytime soon. Tina took a deep breath. Maybe this was a way to get over John, to stop any affection between the two of them. Maybe this was a blessing in disguise. She saw the look of glee on Rachel's face, and such a surge of jealousy stormed through Tina, that she could barely stand it. "Congratulations," John said with a forced smile, too wide and his teeth bared. "It'll be a full month, this one, with so many weddings. If you decided to tie the knot here, that is." "What do you mean, so many?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, still looking from Tina to Victor. "I hadn't noticed so many." "Well, there will be the ceremony for these two," John said, and Tina closed her eyes, bracing herself for the next words, "and of course the ceremony for me and Rachel." Mrs. Fletcher gasped, though it wasn't easy to hear it over Rachel's own gasp. "John?" Mrs. Fletcher said. "Really? Why, that's wonderful news. It's about time, isn't it?" John asked Rachel, beaming down at her like he had never been happier in his life. But Tina could see the anger in his eyes and how it was making his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. Tina looked away and tried not to cry. Chapter 6. Tina arrived home after the dance and dashed up the stairs to her room immediately, without bothering to bid Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher good night. It was rude, but Tina just didn't have the heart for anything right then. She threw herself on the bed, uncaring that she was wrinkling the perfectly pressed lines of Mrs. Fletcher's precious dress. She put her head on her crossed arms to cry. She wouldn't be able to handle it. She wouldn't be able to bear marrying boring, infuriating Victor, only to sit in the church again to watch John marry Rachel. How much of a fool had she been all these years? If only she had married John when he had come to ask for her hand, she would never have even met Victor, and there wouldn't have been a need for all this mess. A mess that was entirely her fault. She remembered John loudly exclaiming to everyone who could or would hear them in the dance hall that soon he would marry Rachel. The only thing that made Tina even vaguely happy was how furious John clearly was about Victor's words, how obvious it was that he had reacted out of jealousy over her. But what did his regard for her help when he was still going to marry someone else? Besides, wasn't this what she wanted? To stop this thing with John before it grew too big? She groaned. But she could not, would not, marry Victor. No, that would be taking things entirely too far. Tina stood up and went to sit at her desk. She pulled a piece of paper from under her small stack of books and didn't mind when it ripped, intent on writing to her friend Leah. Leah would know what to do, she would know the right words that would put Tina's mind to ease. Tina only hoped that Leah's reply would arrive fast. Because Rachel's father, Raymond Cabanne, had announced a forthcoming dinner to celebrate the soon-to-come wedding right after John had made his pronouncement, and Tina didn't see how she would be able to survive that. ******. Leah's answer didn't arrive before the dinner, which was no surprise. It still took quite a while for letters to make their way to and from their writers, even with the marvel of railway travel. The absence of word from her friend left Tina feeling very alone as Mrs. Fletcher helped her get ready again and the three of them made their way to the huge Cabanne mansion. Tina had known Rachel's family was rich, but she hadn't guessed just how rich. This was something she couldn't give John. What if? No, she wouldn't think that of John, who was a good, honest man. The dining hall was cavernous. Tina was relieved when she saw many other guests. She had imagined that the dinner would be only for the few, which would make it even more difficult. Of course, Victor had wormed out an invitation for himself, which was stressful to Tina, yet, on the other hand, it did help her keep up her charade more easily. With Victor present, the other guests weren't as likely to guess her love for John. But as the evening wore on, Tina found it impossible to squelch her desire to speak with John privately, at least one more time. Finally, she found her chance. John, she whispered, looking around, but no one was paying them any mind, and she quickly led him toward a hallway to the side, unused and out of sight of the dining hall. Do you have a moment? He frowned down at her. For what? I need to talk to you, she said, and he relented. Now that she was alone with him, her courage almost deserted her. She looked at him, then away, crossing her arms protectively. John, I wanted to clarify some things and tell you the truth about what's happening. The truth? He asked, taking a step back. The truth is that you were engaged to Victor Ackerman for quite some time. Like you've been engaged to Rachel, Tina shot back, then subsided and shook her head. It's true that we were engaged, but I believed it was broken off once I moved away. I didn't dream he would follow me. I don't want to marry him. So it was easier to, let everyone believe you loved him and were going to marry him? John asked, his gaze on her intense. I don't love him, Tina said firmly, reaching out to hold John's hand in hers. John was struck with silence, looking down at their clasped hands. His expression tightened and he spoke. Why are you telling me this? I will break off my engagement to him, Tina whispered, hope soaring high in her chest. So there's no further misunderstanding. Tina waited, her heart on her throat. Would he understand what she was really saying? What she was really offering? He remained quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. Tina, I never got over you. In fact, I let my heartbreak determine things in my life that, I probably shouldn't have. He took a step toward her as if pulled forward by some unseen source. All this time I've thought of you. And I couldn't believe it when I saw you again. Tina swallowed hard, waiting. I haven't been honest with Rachel. I've been wrong. It's not fair to her. It's not fair to anyone. He sighed heavily. I never got over you, Tina. Never. Joy filled her, and Tina smiled a trembling, relieved smile. There were tears in both of their eyes. I want to take you in my arms, he said gruffly. But it wouldn't be right. Not until I've taken care of things properly. And with that, he left her and returned to the dining hall. Asterisk. Rachel, who had been half hidden at the end of the hallway, heard every single word. She fell back against the wall, trying not to sob. Her throat tightened into a lump, she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Apparently, these two had more history than she knew, and John had actually just now chosen Tina over her not 2 days after announcing to the entire town that they were engaged. What had seemed to Rachel like the fix to her problems had been a push the two had needed to find strength to confess their love to each other. Victor Ackerman's presence did the exact opposite of what she had thought it had done. Rachel stumbled off and went to find her father. He was sitting on a settee and speaking to a friend in even tones. Her arrival effectively ended the conversation. He took one look at his little girl and excused himself from the others. With a hand on her arm, he led her to a corner behind a decorative screen where they wouldn't be seen. Rachel, what's wrong? He asked her quietly, his anxious eyes roaming her face. What has happened? I was looking for you just a moment ago and couldn't find you. Daddy, Rachel started, angry tears making their way down her face. You will never believe what I just heard, the nerve of the man. You have to go and fix this for me, Daddy. I won't be able to handle the disgrace of it, not after he announced our wedding to the whole town, and we threw this party besides. Her father's expression grew dark. John. What has he done now? I thought it was all handled. How did he manage to make a mess of things? I heard him with Tina Bosworth, Rachel whispered to him, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was saying. He said he's always loved her and that he'll break off his engagement with me to marry her instead. What? A frown lowered his brows over his eyes. I can't believe he would speak such nonsense. Obviously, that's not going to happen. No? Rachel asked him, looking up at him with wide, tearful eyes. Of course not, he said with a bold smile. I'm going to go have a talk with Victor, then to John, and I will fix this. Chapter 7. John wasn't planning on doing anything drastic during the party. It would be rude, he thought, and there was no need to humiliate Mr. Cabanne when he had guests in his house. He parted from Tina, though all he wanted to do was be with her. It broke his heart to think of how he would sadden Rachel, but he saw no other choice. It would be even crueler to marry her when he didn't love her, nor did he think Rachel would want that. He approached Rachel and her father and started to sit by them, but before he could, Mr. Cabanne touched his arm and shook his head slightly. John furrowed his brow, not understanding what Mr. Cabanne wanted from him. The man widened his eyes meaningfully and stood, pulling John along with him. John wondered what he wanted. Mr. Cabanne didn't go far, taking him into the very same hallway where John and Tina had spoken. Mr. Cabanne kept his hold on John's arm and tightened it, and John looked down at his grip in surprise. "Now, John, I'm going to ask you to be reasonable," Mr. Cabanne started in a kindly tone of voice, like John was a child who had been caught misbehaving. "Rachel has been hearing things that made her very upset, especially after you announced to everyone that you would be marrying her." John blanched. Rachel had heard something? Had she somehow overheard his conversation with Tina? "Sir." "What has?" he started. "Don't sir me," Mr. Cabanne said, his tone changing completely to anger. "You can't break off your engagement with my daughter. You will not. Have you forgotten who I am and what I've done for you, boy?" John wrenched his arm from the man's grip. What was this? Rachel's father could hardly force him to marry his daughter. Mr. Cabanne had never spoken to him like this, as if he were inferior or an imbecile. Mr. Cabanne would only make Rachel miserable. "You will marry her," Mr. Cabanne said, slowly, as if John had trouble understanding his words. He was taller than John and loomed over him. "I'm the richest man in town, John. I can take everything from you. I can make you a beggar. You'll do as you're told and be the good, obedient man you've been during these years we've known each other, and everything will be just fine." John stared at him. Was this Cabanne's true face? Was this what he, the man John had come to respect and admire, actually thought of John, as an obedient child? John had no words. And would Mr. Cabanne really ruin him? Destroy all he'd built up during these years? Ruin any future he might have? Would Tina even want him if he were a beggar? Doubt coursed through him as he considered it. Would Tina ever accept the possibility of returning to his land to become a hard-working farmer's wife with him? He started to speak, but then fell silent. His shoulders slumped. Mr. Cabanne smiled at him, victorious. John didn't say anything to Tina, not at first, anyway. She didn't need the worry, he told himself. She didn't need any reason to rebuff him again. He would find a way to sort it out. ******. The next day, Tina dreaded talking to Victor about wanting to break it off with him once and for all. She only knew she had to. She had awakened early. Feeling a bit shaky, she got ready, ate a little of the breakfast Mrs. Fletcher had made, and made her way to the nearby park, where she had arranged to meet Victor the evening before at the party. Thankfully, she had to hurry to work soon, so she had an excuse to quickly break off their conversation and go on her way. She perched on a bench and wiped her perspiring hands on her dress. She didn't want to appear nervous, because it would give him an opening. She would be strong and smart and quick to do what she needed to do. Victor didn't take long to show up. He walked up to her smiling, all dressed up as if he thought they would be going out together for a romantic morning. He was in his best jacket and had a glimmer in his eye. Tina straightened her spine and then stood. "Victor," she greeted him somewhat coolly when he tried to stand too close to her. "Thank you for coming, I must talk to you. Let's sit down for a bit." Victor put a hand on her shoulder, keeping it there even when she tried to shrug it off. He grinned at her and his smile made her freeze for a moment. It looked satisfied and a little bit amused, like he was watching her play a joke that she wasn't aware she was playing. "Victor," she started again. "We're not continuing this conversation," he cut her off, shaking his head sharply. "I know what you're here to tell me, and it's not happening, Tina. You are engaged to me. You made me a promise, a commitment. You can't walk away from me to another part of the country and think it's over. You are going to marry me." Tina scowled up at him, finding it hard to breathe. But I'm not going to marry you," she exclaimed, trying to keep her voice as low as she could. She didn't want to attract people's attention and start a scene. "Why did you even come after me when I obviously ran away from you?" "I don't care," he hissed, using his hold on her to bring her close to him. Too close, his breath hot on her face and his eyes dark and crazed. "I love you, Tina. You'll stay with me, or I'll do something crazy." Tina stilled. Finally, she whispered, "Like what?" "I won't live without you," he told her fiercely, using his hold on her to bring her even closer. "I can't do anything without you. These months without you were the worst of my life. You're going to marry me, Tina Bosworth, if it's the last thing you ever do." Tina stared up at him in growing alarm. She couldn't comprehend what it was that he meant. Would he hurt himself if she didn't do as she was told? Tina couldn't have that on her conscience, but at the same time, she couldn't trap herself like that. Or did he mean he would hurt her? "Victor, that is not how this works," she tried, trying to wriggle from his grasp. He let go of her suddenly, making her unbalanced and stumble back. He shook his head, glared at her, and walked away without another word. Tina sank onto the bench, speechless. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Victor entered Raymond Cabanne's office with a flourish, an oily smile on his face and a glint in his eyes. He sauntered up to the desk where the older man was working and sat on the chair in front of it. "It worked very well," Victor said, pleased. "Tina has no way to leave me now, and we'll both get what we want. I will have Tina, and you will have your perfect little son-in-law." "Good," Mr. Cabanne said. "What did she say to you? What did you reply? Tell me everything. The last thing I need right now is for something that we didn't anticipate coming back and making problems for us." Victor rolled his eyes. These businessmen were paranoid and afraid all the time. He couldn't imagine what that would do to one's health. "Nothing went wrong. Everything went just as we planned," he said with a shake of his head. She didn't even manage to get a word in at the end. "I told her how it was going to be, and what was she going to say? No good woman would leave me after that, after what I threatened." "Keep her unsettled," Mr. Cabanne said with a satisfied nod. "I will keep John away from her and occupied with my daughter." Honestly, these two had to start this mess right before things were starting to become settled. "Tina will marry me and love me," Victor snapped, standing up at once. "And that will be that." Mr. Cabanne snorted. "Don't fool yourself. But you're right that she'll marry you. After all, what choice will she have?" Chapter 8. Richard Bosworth sat behind his desk with crossed arms and a thoughtful expression on his face. His daughter looked like him. They had the same brown hair, the same brown eyes, and the same quick mind. He knew precisely why his only daughter had moved to San Diego, and he also knew that Victor had just set off after her. Richard was no fool. He knew what kind of man Victor Ackerman was, and it wasn't the sort of man that a father wanted married to his only daughter. This was why Richard had accepted it so easily when Tina left to go make her life alone. But he had no concrete proof that Victor was a terrible man, and while he trusted his daughter, he knew that a man running after her and trying to conquer her heart held the possibility of changing her mind, or the mind of any woman. What if his going after her in San Diego thawed her heart to him? No, he couldn't leave the situation as it was. In truth, he only finally divulged his daughter's whereabouts to end this thing once and for all. "I worry for her," Leah said, eyes on her lap. She was sitting in one of the chairs in front of Tina's father's desk, her hands clasped anxiously on her lap, while her husband James Hemsworth occupied the other one. "She's my best friend, and her letters of late have made me very concerned. I really think. I believe she needs our help." "I have a plan," Richard said with a shake of his head. "I can't put it into place quite yet as a vital business deal must be completed. However, after that, I plan to make a visit to her myself." "But what if it's too late?" Leah cried. I fear for. Her husband put his hand on her arm. We understand you're a busy man, James said. Don't worry, Mr. Bosworth. If you wish, we'll check on things for you. If you have a bad feeling about Victor, we will surely find something on him. Leah has just received a letter from Tina asking us for a visit. We'll visit her, then, and make sure all is well. I won't let Tina marry anyone but the perfect man for her, Leah said with determination. She's smart, but I'm afraid she might find Victor too charming. We have to help her, if she needs it. I'd be grateful if you'd go in my stead, Richard said. I planned to do this myself, but I see the wisdom in not waiting any longer. He sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. You too, thank you for this help and thank you for coming here to see me. I'm sure that between the three of us, we'll put an end to this, as I planned to do all along. Leah and James nodded. Leah looked relieved and seemed most eager to leave for their long trip. James Hemsworth traveled often for work. It was something that Leah had adjusted to but didn't always like. Mostly, Leah missed Tina. They had never been apart before Leah had married. So now, she often traveled with her husband, not willing to go months without seeing him. It meant a lot of travel, and she'd seen a lot of this expansive country of hers. As it was, James's job put him in contact with a lot of different people in a lot of different fields. It was the easiest thing in the world for a young, charismatic man like James to ask a few pointed questions and receive some curious answers, and before long, James and Leah were on their way to San Diego, with James privy to some very disturbing news regarding Victor. When they arrived in San Diego, James sat with Leah that night on the bed of the inn where they were staying for the next couple of days. He held her hand in his, knowing his news would make her even more worried. Leah, I finally found out what Victor wants out of Tina. Why he's so insistent to go after her. What is it? Leah asked, her voice somber. She wanted to solve this and see her friend. He made some bad investments in a mining company and has suffered huge losses. Leah, the man doesn't have anything to his name. He's in desperate need of money. To tell you the truth, I don't even know how he's managed to move across the country to pursue Tina. Is it her dowry? Leah asked, lifting a hand to cover her mouth. Is that it? Her father is a well-off man, after all, and any man who marries her will get a good amount. It's that as well as the fact that Richard is a good man and would provide help for his daughter and his new son-in-law with anything they needed, James continued with disgust. He liked Richard and the thought of any man taking advantage of his kindness made James sick to his stomach. Leah had the same emotion echoed in her own expression, though even greater, because she had grown up with Richard. He was like a second father to her. He had been the one to introduce her to her James in the first place. She felt a righteous fire being ignited in her chest and stood up, as if she were prepared to find Tina that very moment, no matter how late the hour. We'll stop him, she announced decisively. I won't let him take advantage of Tina and Richard like that. Yes, we will find him, but not in the middle of the night, Leah. James chuckled softly, quite taken with the fiery attitude of his dear wife. Tina lay in bed, first seething and then crying. She didn't know what to do and had no idea how to tell John any of it. She couldn't stop thinking of John, of those moments together at the Cabanne's dining party, how elated she had felt. At that moment, she'd thought the two of them could accomplish anything as long as they were together. She thought everything would be all right, that Victor's arrival had been a blessing in disguise. But now? Now, she had no idea how to deal with the situation. She wanted desperately for Leah to be there with her. She didn't think her best friend would be able to fix the situation, but Leah always knew what to say to bring her spirits up, to get her own mind working to face whatever it was that troubled her. Tina had done nothing wrong and Leah was not here, so now, Tina was going to have to find a way around this alone. If only she could talk to John, but she was afraid of what reaction he would have. Any man would take offense to Victor saying those things and giving such an ultimatum. Just remembering it made Tina shiver. She didn't trust Victor, and in truth, she had no idea what the man might do. She simply didn't know, and she feared trying to break off their engagement again. What if he really did do something tragic? Tina wouldn't be able to live with it. But what was she going to tell John? Her thoughts went around in circles, and she tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Her mind wandered to every scenario possible, even to the possibility that if Victor had not arrived, maybe she and John would be married by now. "You are being silly," she told herself in a hushed voice, wiping her hands over tears. "It's more likely that without Victor, John wouldn't have done anything and ended up married to that Rachel woman." She sighed, then closed her eyes. She would try again to sleep, and maybe in the morning, things would be better. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Tina barely slept, and when she stumbled down to the kitchen the next morning, there was a letter from Leah waiting for her. She ripped it open and read the words, a smile breaking out on her face like the sunrise. Her best friend was coming to visit her after all, and by the postmark on the letter, she would probably arrive very, very soon. Chapter 9. Unlike Tina, John had no best friend to call on. He had no living relatives. For the last 2 years, the closest people to him had been Mr. Cabanne and Rachel, and he could hardly go to them for help. He sat on the edge of his bed with his hands clasped loosely, his eyes on the wall, and his mind running itself ragged trying to find a solution to his situation. Perhaps if he had been braver, he would have gone back to Tina long ago. He would have clasped her hands in his and begged her to marry him. He wouldn't have taken no for an answer, and they could have built a life together. He realized the futility of such thoughts. And now, things were even more drastic. Yet, if Raymond took everything from him, John would still have his farm. It would be the only earthly possession left to him. Would it be enough, even for him? After all the work he had put in during the last 2 years, after the wealth he had gained, would it hurt to be a simple farmer again? He had always loved farming. He would love it again. And if Tina were by his side. But he feared she wouldn't share his thoughts. Not if what she'd told him 2 years ago was any indication. But she had changed, he felt it in his heart. But would she have changed in that regard? He had no idea, and part of him feared finding out. John was a good and honest man, but no sane person would take on a path that could end with a broken heart again. He didn't know if he had the courage to tell Tina what could happen if he married her. How in the world could he find a way to stay in the good graces of Mr. Cabanne without marrying Rachel? John thought and couldn't arrive at an answer. Like Tina that night, he tossed and turned in bed and couldn't sleep. He woke up with a splitting headache and no letter to ease his heart even a little bit. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Tina received another message mid-morning. Leah had already arrived. Tina was beside herself with excitement when she asked Mrs. Fletcher to please prepare another room for Leah and her husband. They shouldn't be at a hotel, she wanted them close. Mrs. Fletcher happily agreed. After all, paying guests were always a blessing. Tina went immediately to meet her friends. Hurrying down the street, she harbored a silent fear that she might bump into Victor. But she made it safely to the hotel without seeing any sign of him. The porter at the hotel went to fetch James and Leah. When Tina caught sight of James's head above the other guests on the stairs, she rushed forward. Leah, who was walking by his side, started to cry when she saw Tina. Tina couldn't stop a few tears from escaping her eyes, either. She hugged Leah tightly, feeling better than she had for days. James carried his bags and his wife's as well, and the three of them walked quickly to the Fletcher house. Tina would have loved to walk in a more leisurely fashion, and perhaps even stop at a cafe to eat a quick bite together, but again, she didn't want to risk seeing Victor, so they moved right along. When they arrived, Tina made quick introductions. She then left James to chat a bit with the Fletchers while she quickly took Leah to her own room, intent on catching up privately on every detail of their lives. A part of her knew that Leah was probably exhausted and would want to rest for a bit before having all of this unloaded on her, but Tina was desperate. "Tina, what's wrong?" Leah asked as soon as Tina closed the door behind her. "Victor is in town," Tina blurted. Leah paused and then said hesitantly, "And that's bad? He's ruining everything." Tina moaned, flopping onto the bed. "Oh, I am so relieved," Leah exclaimed, sitting down beside her. Tina sat up again. "Wait, what? Why are you saying you're relieved? That doesn't make any sense." Leah took her hand, and Tina realized then how upset Leah looked. What was going on? And hadn't Leah arrived awfully quickly to visit? Was there more to Leah's visit than she knew? "What do you know, Leah?" Leah sucked in a deep breath. "Your father was worried and so James and I went after information on Victor. We knew he was coming after you, and we were afraid he would charm you back into his arms. There's something off about Victor. I've always thought so. Your father had a big plan to come west, but he was detained." "What? Daddy was going to come?" Tina could hardly digest the news. "Yes, but we offered to come right away since we were free. James spoke to some people and found out Victor is desperate for money. Tina, he doesn't have anything to his name. He is just after your father's money. You can't accept his proposal. You just can't." "I don't want to marry him," Tina said, leaning forward to hug her friend, suddenly relieved to her bones that Leah was there. In a childish way, she was certain that everything would be all right now that her best friend was with her. "When I told Victor that I would never marry him, he threatened me." "Threatened you?" Leah asked. She pushed Tina away at arm's length, to study her face. "How dare he? It was like a double threat. Like he would harm himself if I didn't marry him or maybe hurt me," Tina admitted with a shake of her head. "He said he couldn't live without me, you know, and I'm afraid of what he might do to himself or me if I go against his wishes. He's evil is what he is," Leah cried, enraged. "And I love John," Tina admitted to her, new tears springing to her eyes when she thought about him. "John Bernett, do you remember him? The farmer who answered my mail-order bride advert? You simply wouldn't believe what has happened, Leah. I met him again when I moved here, and he is perfect, Leah. I can't figure out why in the world I didn't see it 2 years ago. I have to find a way to be with him. I have to." "John Bernett?" Leah asked, wide-eyed. "I can scarcely believe it. Oh, what has happened since you've moved here?" The two looked at each other for a moment, then they both started to laugh. Tina laughed so hard, she nearly cried. Afterward, when she caught her breath again, she felt better, not alone anymore. *****. Victor had indeed caught sight of Tina and Leah and James as they had made their way from the hotel to the Fletchers' house. Shortly after Tina had closed the door behind herself and her friends, he knocked on the door. Though the Fletchers tried to stop him, they were distracted with their new guest, and Victor found an opening to sneak away and up the stairs. Stopping right in front of Tina's door, he pressed his ear to the wood and heard absolutely everything they had said. Furious, he ground his teeth, trying to decide what to do. "Tina knows everything now," he thought a bit desperately. "No way she will stay with me. I need to find another way to get to her." He paced the hallway for a moment, listening while the women laughed together. Tina would never choose him over John, especially now that she knew how poor he was. But what if there was no John? What if he were not in the picture anymore? Victor grinned, an idea springing to his mind. He made his way down the stairs, making an effort to mask the sound of his boots. He would challenge John Bernett to a duel. He knew his marksmanship skills were good, hadn't he been trained as part of his fine education back east? And what woman could resist a man who was willing to challenge someone to a duel? He'd come off as a hero and get rid of John at the same time. He wouldn't even have to kill him. No, he wouldn't go that far. He'd only to have maimed him to come off as the victor. He was sure that Tina would be highly impressed. She wouldn't be able to resist him, and then, her fortune would be his. Chapter 10. While he was at the market that afternoon, John saw Victor coming. Victor was taller and loomed over him. John scowled up at him and didn't move away, didn't give him an inch, even when Victor leaned so close their chests almost touched. The thing was, John was not surprised when Victor issued his challenge. He looked like the sort of man to do it, to throw himself into such a desperate act when he didn't get what he wanted. John guessed that Tina had finally told the man she wouldn't marry him. Victor was wounded and jealous and desperate, and he was there to punish John for it. John always carried his revolver with him, and he made sure it was visible to Victor. Now why would you want to do such a fool thing as a duel? Aren't we civilized here? What I said stands. I challenge you to a duel. It's Tina I want, and Tina I will have. John saw Victor's gun glinting in the sunlight. He studied Victor's face. Would the fool really go through with it? John was a decent shot, but he had no idea what Victor's skill level was. And he wasn't in the mood to die. Let's talk this out, he said, his voice steady and level. We're past talking, Victor cried, sweat gathering on his upper lip. I don't think we are, John said, watching the people clear away when they realized what was happening. John didn't want anyone getting hurt, especially not innocent bystanders. You accept the challenge or not? Victor asked. He held his right hand away from his hip as if itching to draw. I reckon I'm going to need some thinking time. John moved to the right, standing well away from the bystanders. His mind whirled, quickly assessing his best move. If he could injure Victor before Victor drew, that would be the best outcome, for John could see that Victor wasn't going to back down. Well, he wouldn't either. Let's move this out of town, John said, still edging his way right. We don't want anyone to get hurt. We'll do it right here and right now, Victor hollered, his face now suffused with sweat. The idiot, John thought. What has him so desperate? Love for Tina can't be pushing him to such lengths. Does the man love Tina at all? What is he really after? You need money? John asked, his voice steel. Victor bristled, his thumb twitching. I don't need anything. But I'll have my fiancé. I'm telling you that. John was aware of the whispers and murmurs from the crowd who were half cowering, half hiding. Victor snarled at him in a garbled shout, like he was too furious to form words, and went for his gun. John drew his gun and shot. He would have hit the man's shoulder, but he caught sight of Tina making her way to the middle of the empty circle that had formed around the two men. He swerved his shot to the side at the last second. And then Tina started to move closer. Tina! John shouted, suddenly terrified. He felt cold with it. Tina was walking toward Victor, and there was nothing John could do, because Victor's gun was trained right on him. Tina, get back. What are you doing? Victor, stop this right now, Tina demanded, drawing herself up to her full height. She seemed suddenly huge, as if they had been two stupid boys play fighting, and she was the sensible lady who had come to stop them making a mess in her home. She stepped right in front of Victor's line of sight, though at least she had the sense not to walk in front of his gun. I don't love you, Tina snapped when Victor opened his mouth as if to speak. I love John Bernett, the man you're trying to kill right now. Did you think that killing John would make me more fond of you? It will only make me hate you even more. Victor flinched and sputtered, but quickly drew himself up again, his gun pointing widely as he gestured. With your dowry, we'll be rich again in no time, and you will have the life you always said you wanted to have. I am not going to marry you, Tina said again, ignoring everything he had said. So, you're going to marry him? Victor asked, and John's blood ran cold when he realized what the man was going to reveal. Raymond Cabanne will take every single penny from him if he doesn't marry Rachel, and your precious John will be left a farmer. Again. Is that what you want, Tina? To be some farmer's wife in the middle of nowhere? Sweat was dripping from Victor's face. He was a pathetic sight, but he still held a gun. John had had enough. He started toward Victor, his own gun trained on the man's chest. This is over, he declared harshly. Put down the gun. It's over. He could feel Tina staring at him, and part of him dreaded what he might see in her eyes. She would never want to be a farmer's wife, she'd made that clear. This was the end of everything between them. But he couldn't abide it a moment longer. This fool was putting people in danger. He wouldn't have it. Victor gaped at John as he came nearer, and John realized he was staring at a broken man. A broken, desperate man. Victor made a horrible sobbing sound and dropped his gun. John moved quickly, picking it up and shoving it under his belt. He holstered his own gun. He looked at the crowd. "It's over, folks. Go on about your business." He turned to Tina, his heart on his throat, but Tina lifted one brow and didn't even hesitate. "I love you no matter what, John Bernett," she said firmly. "I no longer care if I have to be the wife of a penniless farmer. All I care about is if the farmer is you." John scooped her up in an enormous embrace, holding her against his chest, and burying his face in her neck. She was laughing now, and he heard the joy in her laughter. He put her back on the ground and got down on one knee. It was as if Victor no longer even existed. John wasn't even aware of how the townsfolk had drawn nearer again, watching them with silly grins on their faces. John didn't see Raymond Cabanne and Rachel take 2 aborted steps forward. He only had eyes for Tina. "Tina," he said, "will you marry me? I don't care about anything else anymore. Let Raymond and Rachel make their threats. I won't bend to them. I'll be the richest penniless farmer in the world if I have you by my side." Tina's eyes spilled tears. "Oh, John," she whispered. "You'll be the richest farmer in the world," a voice called out, and it sounded amused. "With or without the woman." John and Tina both turned to look at the man. John didn't recognize him. He was tall and blonde, though later he would be introduced as James Hemsworth, the husband of his future wife's best friend. "What?" Tina asked, confused. "What do you mean, James?" "Now, wait a moment," Mr. Cabanne said, walking forward. James turned to look the man in the eyes and raised one eyebrow, and when he spoke pointedly. "What I mean is," James continued, "I have learned something most interesting on my travels. The area where John's farm sits is actually known for its silver lines. The miners I spoke to are nearly fairly certain that you wouldn't have to dig for long before you find something valuable there. You might actually be a very rich man with nothing but your farm, John Bernett." Mr. Cabanne stopped, and his shoulders slumped where he stood, his efforts of 2 years now rendered completely obsolete. There was no way he was getting the farm from John now that John knew the truth. John, in turn, stared at James with wide eyes. "What? That can't be true," he said, getting up from his bended knee. "I've never heard about it." "It's the truth," James told him. "The miner I spoke to had done work in several areas of land around your farm. I'm guessing someone kept this information from you for his own gains." "Now wait a minute," Victor shouted. He stood there, red-faced and trembling. "You never told me that, Cabanne." Mr. Cabanne merely shrugged. Rachel ran to John's side and he put his arm around her. John could see by her face that Rachel had known about it all along. He stared at her and shook his head. She had the decency to look away. "Well, looks like this duel has a winner," Tina said with a smile, leaning against John. John smiled and hugged her tightly to his side. Chapter 11. 3 weeks later, John and Tina married. James and Leah, who had to travel again soon, stayed only long enough for the ceremony. Tina didn't want to marry without her father by her side, and he was sent for and gladly came. During those 3 weeks before the wedding, John courted Tina. They went to dances and restaurants and plays like young sweethearts do, standing a bit too close and sharing chaste goodnight kisses. Tina was delighted to have Leah there by her side, and John and James got to know each other. James, who was well versed in the world and knew many people in the mining business, helped John make arrangements regarding mining his farm and what that now meant. John might have grown suspicious of this kind of help after learning the truth about Mr. Cabanne, whom he had trusted and looked upon as a father. Instead, John found a kindred spirit in James. Tina, when she wasn't out with her future husband or her best friend, or indulging Mrs. Fletcher by playing dress-up, often sat in her room and looked out the window, taking the time to ponder her life. She was going to have the life she had always wanted, after all. She would marry a rich man who loved her deeply, and she wouldn't need to work on the farm as she had feared at first, even though she wouldn't have minded it now. Not if it meant being with John. Tina was secure and grateful that her love didn't depend on riches. She wouldn't have been able to say that honestly before, but she now knew it to be true. And in that truth, she rejoiced. It wasn't only Tina who rejoiced in it, John rejoiced, too. He was now secure in Tina's love, knowing she would have tried her best at being a farmer's wife if it had been necessary. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.